The first $100,000 is not important because of the number itself. It matters because it is the point where your money stops being only something you protect and starts becoming something that can actually help you. Before that point, almost all of the work is still being done by you. You wake up, you earn, you save, you delay, you cut back, you try again. And if you are honest, that stage often feels painfully slow. That is why so many people misunderstand wealth. They think wealth begins when the returns look exciting. It usually begins much earlier in the stage where nothing feels exciting at all. The first 10,000 feels small, the first 20 feels slow, the first 50 feels like a grind. And the first 100 often feels almost unreasonable while you are trying to build it. But that is the phase that matters most, because that is the phase where you are becoming the kind of person who can actually keep money long enough for money to become productive. Most people want the second half of the story. They want the point where the graph starts curving upward. They want the phase where one good year in the market produces more than they used to save in 2 or 3 years. They want the part where money appears to be making itself. But they do not want the first half. They do not want the discipline, the boredom, the restraint, or the repeated feeling that the progress is too small to matter. That is why so many people never reach the point where compounding becomes visible enough to feel magical. The magic is delayed by design. That delay is not a flaw in the process. It is the process. People love the penny doubling example because it dramatizes this perfectly. 1 cent becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, and for a long stretch, it looks ridiculous. The beginning appears too small to take seriously. Then the final days do what compounding always does when it is left alone long enough. They stop looking gradual and start looking absurd. That is the seduction of the example. But the real lesson is not that numbers can get big. The real lesson is that growth often looks unimportant until it has already become powerful. That is exactly what your first $100,000 feels like. For a while, your net worth barely seems alive. You save and save and save and still feel as if you are dragging the entire thing uphill with your bare hands. That is because in the beginning, your labor is the engine. Your discipline is the engine. Your willingness to not spend what you could have spent is the engine. And that is why the first $100,000 is so difficult. Not because the number is magical, because the money is not yet large enough to do enough work on its own. It is still depending on you to carry the full load. That is the truth no one explains clearly enough. Before $100,000, your wealth is still mostly a product of what you earned and did not consume. After that point, the returns begin to matter enough that the experience changes, not immediately, not in one cinematic moment, but noticeably your capital begins to contribute something meaningful. A 10% return on $5,000 is nice. A 10% return on $100,000 is different. At $5,000, the return feels like pocket money. At $100,000, the return starts to feel like another participant. That is the shift at first. You are the only worker in the room. Then eventually your money becomes a second worker. And once you have a second worker, the whole pace of life begins to change. That is why rich people often stay rich more easily than poor people become rich. Not because every rich person is a genius, because money has an advantage once enough of it exists. Capital multiplies more capital, and when it does, the whole process begins to feel unfair in a way. It is the first part of the climb is brutally dependent on your behavior. The later part becomes more dependent on the size of the base you already built. This is why the first $100,000 is the hardest, because most of it will come from you, from your work, from your decisions, from your ability to keep a gap between what you earn and what you spend. That gap is where the first real wealth is born. If there is no gap, there is no capital. If there is no capital, there is nothing to compound. And if there is nothing to compound, then you can spend years waiting for a wealth explosion that never comes. That is why the first lesson here is not about investing brilliance. It is about savings discipline. The majority of your first $100,000 will not come from some heroic stock pick. It will not come from one lucky trade. It will not come because you discovered a hidden code. It will come because you worked, kept more than average, and repeated that long enough for the base to form. That sounds boring. Good. Boring is where the truth usually lives at the beginning. Behavior matters more than sophistication. Live within your means, then live below them. Take the employer match. Use the tax advantages if they are available. automate what you can, reduce obvious leakage, keep going when the process still feels too small to impress anybody. That is where most people fail. The numbers move too slowly. The sacrifice feels too visible and the reward feels too delayed. So they stop, or they speculate, or they start telling themselves that the process is not working because the progress still looks ordinary. But the early stage always looks ordinary. That is the price of compounding. The first stretch is where almost nothing about the outside appearance tells you how powerful the math can become later. This is why the phrase "trust the process" matters here. But I want to make it sharper. Do not just trust the process. Understand the role you play in it. At the beginning, you are not watching compounding. You are manufacturing the conditions that will allow compounding to matter. Those are two different things. That is why income matters so much. A lot of people hear this sort of conversation and immediately turn everything into an expense. Cutting sermon, spend less, cut more, cancel the subscriptions, skip the dinners, drive the older car. Yes, all of that can help, but there is a limit. There are only so many expenses you can cut. Especially now, housing is expensive, insurance is expensive, food is expensive, energy is expensive for a lot of people. The idea that they can simply trim their way to a first $100,000 is fantasy. At some point, income growth matters just as much as spending restraint. You have to respect both sides of the equation. The people who reach $100,000 fastest are often not just the ones who slash spending, they are the ones who also grow their earnings. A raise matters, a better skill matters, a more valuable role matters, a smarter career move matters, a side business matters, negotiation matters. This is one of the most overlooked truths in wealth building. People become obsessed with cutting because cutting feels immediate. But expansion matters too. The first $100,000 is usually built through a combination of two things. You do not spend everything, and you do not remain the same earner forever. That combination is far more powerful than either one on its own. This is why I dislike the way sacrifice gets framed. Too many people hear sacrifice and imagine a life sentence. That is not the point. The point is not to spend your whole life living in self-denial. The point is to compress enough discipline into the early phase that you reach the compounding phase sooner. That is a very different thing. Short-term pain can be intelligent if it shortens the distance to the point where your money starts helping you. That is the trait, not misery for its own sake, delay versus acceleration. Every extra year you postpone the first $100,000 is a year you postpone the moment where capital starts to matter enough to change the speed of your net worth. That is the silent cost. People feel the cost of sacrifice immediately. They rarely feel the cost of delay until many years later. That is why delay is so dangerous. It feels harmless. One more year of saving very little. One more year of saying you will start once things calm down. One more year of treating wealth as a future project instead of a present behavior. That is how decades disappear. Now, if I were trying to build the first $100,000 as efficiently and sanely as possible, I would think in two directions at once. First, I would build a habit of consistent investing into simple, productive assets. I would use tax-advantaged accounts where possible. I would take a match if it existed. I would not wait for confidence. I would use broad index exposure, ETFs, mutual funds if appropriate. Nothing exotic. Nothing requiring me to pretend that I know more than I do. At that stage, simplicity is not a weakness. It is an advantage. Simple and repeated beats complicated and abandoned. The second thing I would think about is ownership beyond cash savings. Sometimes that means a home. Not because buying a house is automatically wise. It is not. A house can be a smart long-term asset or a terrible short-term burden depending on the price payment, location, and timing. But in the right circumstances, a home can become a major part of the first serious wealth base. Not because houses are magical, because leverage plus inflation plus forced equity can be powerful if they are used carefully. If you put down $40,000 on a $400,000 property and the value rises by 10%, the gain happens on the whole asset, not just on the down payment. That is the power of leverage, of course. Leverage cuts both ways. That is why it is so dangerous in the hands of the impulsive and so useful in the hands of the prudent. So I am not telling you that housing is the answer. I am telling you that building the first $100,000 often happens faster when you stop thinking only in terms of cash and begin thinking in terms of assets accumulated. That can be a brokerage account, that can be a retirement account, that can be equity in a home. The wrapper matters less than the principal. The principle is that you need claims on productive or appreciating assets, not just effort stored in checking. Now, I need to say something equally important. Do not let the first signs of acceleration make you stupid. This is another trap at first. Your main temptation is to give up because the progress looks too slow later. Your temptation changes later. You start thinking maybe you are a genius. That is equally dangerous. When your net worth starts growing by more in 1 year than you used to save in several, you must not mistake mathematics for personal brilliance. A person with $500,000 earning 10% will look much smarter than a person with $20,000 earning the same rate. But the difference is not intelligence. The difference is scale. That is why I tell people that maximizing the first $100,000 is often more important than maximizing your first few percentage points of return. A slightly lower but consistent path that gets your capital base real can beat a more exciting but erratic path that constantly knocks you off course. This is why I do not worship cleverness. I worship repeatability. Repeatable behavior is what builds the first $100,000. Repeatable behavior plus capital is what builds the next several $100,000. Then eventually, the machine begins to look almost unfair from the outside. That is the phase. Everybody sees. That is the phase. Everybody envies. That is the phase people call luck. But that phase is only dramatic because they did not watch the build. They only saw the explosion. They did not see the years of restraint that made the explosion possible. That is why I say do not worship the explosion. Worship the build. The build is where the whole future is decided. The build is where your habits get tested. The build is where the process still feels boring enough that you can quit without embarrassment. The build is where most people choose comfort over acceleration. And that is why the first $100,000 is such an important dividing line. It is not the destination. It is the point where your money stops being only a saved result of labor and starts becoming an active participant in your future. That changes everything. It changes the speed, it changes the psychology, it changes how delay feels, it changes how setbacks feel, and perhaps most importantly, it changes your relationship with time before that point. Each year of inaction costs you some progress. After that point, each year of inaction costs you a more powerful machine that could have been running. That is why I want younger people especially to understand this. Now, you do not need to feel ready. You need to begin. You do not need a perfect plan. You need a repeatable one. You do not need to know the next great stock. You need to get into productive assets and keep feeding them. You do not need a glamorous story. You need enough discipline to survive the part where the story still looks dull. That is what eventually creates freedom. The first $100,000 is hard because you are still carrying almost all of the weight alone. Everything after that gets easier, not because life suddenly becomes generous, but because you are no longer doing the full job by yourself. Your money has finally become large enough to help. That is the real secret. The first $100,000 is not a prize. It is the point where capital stops being a spectator and becomes a worker. Once you understand that, the goal becomes much clearer. You are not trying to impress anyone with a round number. You are trying to reach escape velocity. And once you get there, you finally discover what rich people rarely explain properly and poor people are rarely taught early enough. At first you work for money. Then eventually, if you build carefully and persist long enough, money begins working for you. The first $100,000 is where that relationship finally starts to change. That is why it matters. That is why it is hard. And that is why, once you get there, the whole game stops feeling impossible and starts feeling alive.